I want to ask you a little bit about your work with a choir and a string quartet in Barcelona on a composition you wrote. How did that come to be?
Well, I was asked to do a project, and they asked me if I could do something that I had never done before. And I said I would really like to teach a choir, a string quartet, to play color. So I would be the light technician, and depending on the color that I shined on them, beamed on them, then they would play that note. And we tried this, and in the end it worked. And I composed the music from the colors of the building. So this was in Palau de la Música in Barcelona, which is a very colorful building. For a few weeks, I picked up the sound of the building by the colors. When I transposed the colors into sound, they sounded great, and especially the glass, the ceiling was perfect. And then I created the composition, and the musicians performed the score by looking at the light, basically. So music was, it had to be slow because you had to change. The musicians needed time to see the change of color. So I couldn't really create quick rhythms, otherwise they wouldn't pick up the color. So it was slow music with different chords that kept changing. So there was the choir was divided in 4 sections, so there were 4 different lights. If I shined 4 red lights, they all sang F. If then I changed one of the 4 lights into green, then they would be singing F and A. And then if I had a blue light, then they would be singing C. So then we would have a different chord. So I was playing with lights, and then different chords were being created.
That's Neil Harbison. He is a cyborg. That's what he calls himself. He thinks everybody in the world should be some version of a cyborg. And he was born, he can't see color. So he had a camera implanted into the base of his skull that translates the colors he sees into sound. So that's who he is and what he does. We got this interview with him at the end of last year, and we didn't really know what we were going to do with it. So we thought, well, this is an interesting guy that you definitely want to hear from. He's got this experience, this cool thing that you have to describe, and he's also advocating something in the world that's kind of a nice mix of things. And we got the interview done, and Anna Maria sat down in the studio face-to-face with him, and we could have just put it to air like that without any problem. And so there are a couple of reasons for going this route, which was cutting and pasting and having Anna Maria present it as something like a doc, kind of illustrated interview, a talk tape of one. I don't know exactly what to call it. It was this sort of thing that we didn't really know what it was going to be when we started. So that's where we got into it. There's sort of, I guess, a couple of reasons. One, the potential for just making it pretty is really quite obvious. I mean, he's describing, conducting a choir. You want to hear the choir. That's fairly obvious. There's not a lot of rocket science there. You want to hear what he's talking about. You have the opportunity to do that. You do it. But the secondary thing, and this is where I think there's more mileage out of this stuff, is that when he's describing, I think there's a second layer to what makes this one work, which is that the sound actually enhances your ability to understand what he's describing to you, right? So it's pretty, and it's bells and whistles, and we're all for that because it's ear candy, but it actually goes some way towards explaining and I think illustrating the point that he's making. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to Steve Wadhams, who has good enough pitch that he can actually tell me what an F and a C is. So in that case, you hear what he's saying. If I put this light, they sing this. If I put this light, they sing this. And if you're like me and you don't know what an F and a C is, and you don't understand what a chord like that would sound like, having that in the background actually goes a long way towards illustrating what we're talking about. There have been a few other things where we've been able to do that. And I think the big takeaway for me out of this was that, this is infinitely flexible, right? We didn't know what this was when we started. We just kind of went into it with the idea that you would break it apart and put it back together, and you could go any which way. I think the big lesson was you can go really, really down the rabbit hole on this stuff. If you're working on this and you have a week in the summer where there's not much going on, and your job is just to play with this and see what's possible, you can end up going way too far. So I am also indebted to Steve Wadhams for having a listen of some stuff I was trying to do and saying, no, this is confusing me. This is clarifying. Go with what's clarifying. And that to me was the big takeaway from this, is that as tempting as it is to just do stuff for the sake of doing it because it's fun and we all geek out over this and it's pretty to listen to, you can actually do damage to a perfectly good story by going too far down that road. So there were sort of two lessons here. One is this is infinitely flexible. You can do anything with it. And two, that doesn't mean you should. There have to be breaks.
What was too much?
Well, so he talked about how he learned, and this didn't end up making the interview, but he talked about the process of learning how to differentiate colors, right? So we see colors, we just learn that as we go along in life. He had to go through the process of starting out with 6 and then 24 and eventually 360 audio tones for a huge variety of colors. So every color has it's like a light spectrum. There's a corresponding spot in the audio spectrum that he hears. And he had to teach his brain how to recognize those and how to, what I was trying to do was that to illustrate that you start with this and then you end up with this huge sound. And so I wanted something that was a small sound to that and then a big sound. And in the end, it was confusing. It didn't actually add any, and you didn't need that as part of the story anyway. It became sound for the sake of sound, not for the purpose of actually furthering the piece, like the ability of the listener to follow the piece.
How long did it take you to produce?
It was kind of a weird one because we recorded it back in June, and then it sat there for a good 2 months until I got back to it. And I had a couple days to sort of cut it up into pieces, and then a couple more days later to think about sound. I mean, I'd say in total it was probably 4 or 5 days of definitive sort of all day, everyday work. I think you could probably get faster at it as you went along. If we'd had a blueprint from the start and it wasn't just, well, let's see what we can do, and the luxury of doing it in the summer when, frankly, you can afford to just see where it goes. If it had been during the regular season with a blueprint, I think you could have moved that along faster.
For sure.
What's your eureka moment when you thought, I can do something? What made you go?
Well, I mean, I think the thing that made it intriguing was a couple of things. One, you had to go some way. The thing that to me that made it lend itself not towards just him in a room with Anna Maria doing an interview, which would be a perfectly valid way of presenting it, was that you needed to get over the hump of explaining, wait, he's a cyborg? Okay, how does this thing work? This thing is wired into his skull? And, he's fine at explaining that, but he doesn't really, you had to do a certain amount of fairly heavy lifting in terms of the mechanics of how this stuff works. And you didn't want to get bogged down in that. You needed to get past that pretty quickly, and you needed to sell that in order to get people in. And so in that way, it felt like Anna Maria telling you that story instead of listening to him explain it in a real, sort of real-time conversation was a better way of getting past that. And then the other thing was once you start realizing that, okay, he hears colors, that seems to just scream for sound of some kind, then there's, okay, I can make this pretty, and that's tempting. And then I think the big moment for me was realizing that you could actually take specifically what he was describing and illustrate it in a specific enough way with the pitches where, oh, I actually get it in a way that I don't think I would have had that sound not been there. That was the big moment to me where it was like, yeah, no, this is going to work. This is going to work.
Just a question about
Yeah.
how you framed it to the audience. Was it, come along with me as I take a journey and meet this character, or
I think
sat down with
the
you
best
before?
thing we did was that we didn't really bother to explain it. And what I mean is that I think for a long time, up until about 5 or 6 years ago, I'd say the current was we were kind of phobic about breaking the wall around, this is a live radio program. Everything you are hearing is happening right now in real time. Like we kind of got freaked out whenever we admitted that something was taped, or we worried that people wouldn't follow. We telegraphed every piece of tape we played really
in this really heavy-handed kind of way. So we're going to play you some tape. It's recorded in advance. It's someone else's voice. Don't get freaked out. Here it comes now. Again, this is already on like we just overcompensated. And I think once we got a little more comfortable with saying, like, you don't really have to explain to people. They'll follow you, right? I mean, it's radio. It's magic. That's all you need to know. Right? Like, we don't need to explain it. You don't care. We don't need to care either. And I think once we get over that.
Point. Just like any freelancers in the room that have worked with me before know that I say that every time. It's like everyone always sets up a clip, and then we hear the clip, and they say what's happening. Like, you don't need to say what the person is about to say in the clip. It's something we all do, not just freelancers. I didn't mean to like pick on you guys, but everybody does it all the time. And sometimes it's just like allow the tape or the sound to do the work. It actually usually does the work for you. You don't have to. Sorry, I just jumped in.
No, but actually this is good because it was actually credit, I think, to a lot of what Spark was doing at the time that sort of pushed us to start saying, like, we sounded dated, right? Every time we did that, it sounded like we were editorially on point, but just stylistically way behind on stuff. We sounded old and dated and just not really current enough. And it was actually a lot of what Spark was doing that kind of pushed us. So.